Okay, everybody. Welcome to our last keynote for this afternoon. It's been a fabulous day so far, lots to think about. My name's Miley Joseph. I'm working at the State Library of New South Wales, so I'll be the chair for this session. You've come to the session about relationality and the unrealised potential of digital collections. Perhaps, like me, you haven't met Mike Jones before. I've been stalking poor Mike on Twitter for some time, looking at links to his work and listening to what people had to say about him, so I can't tell you how excited I am to actually meet him here today. Mike Jones is an archivist, a collections consultant and historian based in Melbourne. With a background in art history and a decade of experience as an archivist, Mike has published and presented widely in Australia and internationally, and he's an active member of the GLAM and digital humanities communities. He's currently he's finished working on his PhD at the University of Melbourne's School of Historical and Philosophical Studies, exploring relationality and the interconnectedness of archives and museum collections. He's also a research associate at Museums Victoria and works as a researcher, archivist and freelance collections consultant. So please join with me in welcoming Mike.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and also pay my respects to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people joining us here today. As someone who works with relationships and interconnection, it's really important to remember the close connections that exist between Indigenous communities and the country that we all live and work on, and the connection that many of us have to colonial institutions that have been involved in the dispossession of those communities. And I think it's something that should run through all of the work that we do. In terms of my talk today, you'll see that there's a bit link on the front page of my slides. That's because I tend to use a lot of slides when I present, and some of them will be moving past fairly quickly. A lot of them have references and things on the bottom and connections to other things, as sort of befits the talk itself. So if you want to use that bit link, you should be able to get to a PDF of the slides where you can follow along, and that link will appear at the end as well. So you can avoid taking notes and trying to keep up. So as we're in Sydney, I want to start just a few hundred metres down the road at the Australian Museum. And on the 13th of October 2017, the newly refurbished Westpac Long Gallery opened at the museum. And up on the mezzanine level of that gallery, those of you who've been there may have seen this, we have these cascading digital displays where images fall from the ceiling, images of documents and people and artefacts. And when you touch one of those documents, it becomes the centre of your attention, and other things cluster around it, other documents, other images, other artefacts, small artworks, to help tell the story about people and Australian history. And it's a really interesting interface that doesn't rely on text search and doesn't rely on needing to know keywords and type things in, to give you a little cluster of interconnected knowledge that you can explore as a user in the gallery space. And these notions of interconnection run throughout that gallery space. Down on the ground floor in the 200 Treasures exhibition, the text on the wall says, "These treasures reflect the varying significance we attach to the things that touch our lives. A treasure's value also lies in its context, and every object is part of an entangled relationship between people, nature, and culture. Discover these complex relationships through a series of tableaux, each a means to frame a time, a place, or a story." And we see these sorts of interconnected spaces in museum exhibitions a lot in contemporary museums. It's part of this kind of idea of the relational museum that's been around for a while now. And it includes notions of complexity and multiplicity, like polyvocal and contested meanings existing in the same space, and about participation and the contextual and temporal nature of knowledge. But we often don't see these sorts of connections in the collection management systems that we use, the documentation of our collections, or in the way we present hundreds, thousands, millions of collection items online to the general public. Yet these ideas of interconnection go back quite a long way. You can trace them back, if you like, to the cabinets of wonder, the cabinets of curiosity of the 16th century. This is believed to be the first engraving of a Renaissance humanist cabinet that contains natural history specimens, and you'll note that there's library specimens down the side, library books and a library down the side as well. That sort of interconnected knowledge. It's the same sort of time that Francis Bacon was writing about the things that you need for learning, that you need a library, a botanical and zoological garden, a stillhouse or laboratory for conducting experiments, and a large collection of natural and man-made items. And this learning emerges from those interconnected collections and being able to navigate through those collections and bring knowledge together. Our documentation, in terms of collection documentation, has never actually been particularly good at representing those sort of interconnected knowledge systems. This is a really early catalogue from the 17th century from the John Tredescant's collection. It was father and son, both called John Tredescant, just to make things confusing. Their collection ended up going to Elias Ashmole, and his collection formed the heart of the Ashmolean Museum, which could claim to be the first kind of public museum as we know it, or modern museum as we know it, established in the 17th century. And it's broken up into a few categories. One of my favorites is the third one here, diverse sorts of strange fishes. But it's essentially just a list. There's not a huge amount of other knowledge here. It doesn't give you other pathways to follow. There's a few little bits, like at the top of this page, that says the claw of the bird rock, who as author's report is able to truss an elephant. But it doesn't tell you who the authors were or give you other pathways to follow. It doesn't give you a reference or a citation. So jumping forward again, I'm going to move quickly through a lot of history here. French Revolution and revolutionary France, 1791. And this sort of era was considered to be, firstly, the birth of modern archives as we know it, because they needed to work out how to manage the historic collections from the old regime and to manage this collection with separate provenance and separate record-keeping systems from the new government. It was also the year of the 1791 French cataloguing code, which library historians might know was when catalogue cards were first mentioned in print, although they wanted to use playing cards as a kind of practical measure because playing cards were blank on the back, so a good kind of practical way of getting everyone to use the same sized format. And cataloguing cards, as we know, were used throughout the 19th century, throughout the early 20th century. Some catalogue card systems are still used today. And they're about helping people do things like find a book in the catalogue, find the book on the shelves, and navigate their way through. In museums, there are a few different requirements around catalogue cards and cataloguing systems, although some of the same technologies were used. An item like this, you need to know more about it than just where it is, because there's a lot about this object that you don't know by retrieving the object itself, unlike with many books. So you need both a physical description to locate it, and you also need some knowledge about it. This was a spring gun that was set to maim or kill poachers or body snatchers, which was illegal from 1827, because it deterred them by killing them, essentially. And that bit of knowledge has presumably come from somewhere and is linked to legislation and other things, but that fact has just been extracted out and included in a catalogue entry without connections to other things. Other sorts of technologies, this is the same item described in a book, and it's a more evocative kind of narrative description and tells you a bit more about it. People got quite excited by this catalogue at the time. There was a review in the Age newspaper where the reviewer said that this catalogue merits the title of book, a book that this reviewer found to be vastly more entertaining than many best-selling novels. And that was in 1949. So this is an evocative description, but again doesn't give you pathways to follow. It doesn't give you references. It doesn't give you other paths to explore. And in this case, it should have certainly given you at least one other path to explore, because Penrose took this text almost word for word from a 1901 article by Miller Christie, which had the great title of Man Traps and Spring Guns. So in this case, it could have done with a citation. So a lot of my research has also looked at the effect of computers and computing on these sort of documentation systems. And we heard in the talk from Genevieve Bell this morning some of that early computing history. Libraries started to pick this up fairly early. They started to use things like Hollerith catalogue cards to help manage acquisitions and distribution of library materials. In the 50s, people started to look at how computers could potentially be used to create data banks to help people like archaeologists analyze the shape and pattern of archaeological materials. And then libraries started to explore this as well. So in the 1960s, libraries started to say, well, what could computers do for us beyond just managing these basic kind of acquisition and distribution processes? And this work by Thomas Merrill, he starts out with a kind of thought experiment of, well, if we automated all these different parts of the library, we could use computers to produce a faster catalog, to get people to the book they're looking for faster, to potentially retrieve the book using automated systems and get it back to them faster. We could speed everything up. But he then goes on to say that that system would yield pretty unsatisfactory results. If taken to its logical limit, it's patently absurd, and then in any event, if it solves any problem at all, it solves the wrong problem. He wasn't interested really in just speeding up exactly what libraries were doing at the time, because he said, well, all it does is get you to a book that contains hundreds and hundreds of pages, and then the user still has to do all this work to find out the answer to the question that they've got. What he wanted, like the title of his article or his piece, is a question-answering system. So this links back to these kind of dreams of computer brains and artificial intelligence that we heard about this morning. And so he was thinking, well, what we should do is try and represent in computer memory a model of a significant portion of the universe. And then we could get the computer to improve that model, make inductive generalizations, and finally to answer questions pertaining to the model in an intelligent fashion. So it really is looking for a kind of question-answering machine or an artificial intelligence that can answer people's questions. J.C.R. Licklider was interested in similar things in the mid-1960s. This fascinating book for people interested in the history of this called Libraries of the Future, where he tries to imagine what libraries might look like in the year 2000. He gets it a little bit wrong in terms of particularly the amount of data that would be around. So he wanted question-answering machines as well, and he thought, well, as part of this, we've got to make all the data in libraries machine-readable. So he tried to do a calculation of how much data, if you made it machine-readable, would be in all the libraries in all the world in the year 2000. And the number he came up with was 570 terabytes. I think we've gone a little bit past that. And in 2017, it's thought that we were creating about 2.2 million terabytes per day. So these are quite different numbers from the ones imagined in the 60s. Museums, they also had a conference in 1968 that was looking at the potential of computers in museums. And they're interested in similar things, not just sort of cataloging and automation, but things like stylistic analysis, like continuing the trends of trying to look at Renaissance artists based on the shape of the ears of the people in the paintings. Looking at touchscreens and light pens, so you could use computers as part of design. And looking also at kind of question-answering systems of their own. How could you create these networks of content that would help people navigate through and find the things that they're interested in? And they even dreamed of things like stylistic analysis by computer, again, looking for this kind of artificial intelligence component where you could just wheel a painting in front of a computer. And with this great kind of 60s phrase of its ultra-silent infrared pre-sensors, reaching out and saying, yes, it's a Rembrandt, late period, 2 years before he died, based on a drawing in a collection in the British Museum. Again, we haven't quite got there yet. But they also had all these ideas for catalogues. And they're saying, well, apart from all of that, yes, it will also speed up our cataloging systems. We can produce a master file. We can produce sorted lists automatically off that without having to do manual sorts. And it will hugely increase the speed and efficiency of that entire process. The Mark pilot was happening at the same time. So they reported on that in 1968, having started in about 66. And we're producing similar sorts of illustrations of what these sort of cataloging processes might look like. But the data that was coming out of these was quite basic. It was quite limited. Just a little bit of fielded information, a few classifications, a few codes. And that's because the process of getting this in was actually really laborious and the capacity of these systems was really limited. You had to fill out coding sheets that looked like this from the Science Museum of Victoria. You had to fill it out all in capital letters because the machine didn't have enough memory to put in lowercase characters as well as uppercase characters. And you can still find some descriptions in the Museum Victoria cataloguing system today that have been rolled through all the way from that and are still in capital letters because of these coding sheets. Here's what computer coding looked like in the early 1980s for people working in museums. Jeff Walker working on computer entry for the Donald Thompson collection in his wonderful cardigan on his wonderful sheepskin chair. And what they were producing were static microfiche catalogues, which in libraries were potentially made available to the public. In museums remained internal systems that were just used by curators and staff to manage and locate collection material. And there was a lot of sharing of technology here. So the Museums Victoria, or the Science Museum of Victoria system, was actually using technology developed for the Swinburne University Library Catalogue. And that's a picture of the system here. And the man in the great shirt collar, Klaus Wilwock, he went to the museum in 1977, and he tried to boil it down. He said, well, the purpose of a library catalogue is fairly basic. It's whether the library holds a particular item of which the author and title is known, and if it does, where to find it, and what materials the library holds on a given subject or by a given author, what editions are held of a given work, and where to find them. A museum catalogue, I would imagine, serves very similar functions. So this aspect of kind of computing and automation had been boiled right down to exactly what Merrill said was kind of the wrong problem in the early 1960s. It was just about speeding up all these existing processes. And then came the internet in the early 1990s. And people started thinking, well, how do we start getting collection material online? And they started fairly early. So this is a site from 1993 as it would have appeared. Those of you who remember computing in these days, this is what would have appeared like if you were using Netscape on a Mac in 1993 and looking at a Library of Congress website of scrolls from the Dead Sea. And there's some digitized content, there's some textual content. And amazingly for this, I think there's a lesson in this for all of us. That web content is still available online on the Library of Congress site. And you can't say that for many sites from libraries in 1993. The Smithsonian went online in 1995, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1996, etc. Mid-90s in particular, there was an explosion of museum, archive, library websites. And people were starting to put collection content online, and they were starting to extract a lot of that content from those underlying systems and saying, well, we'll make it available to the public by just extracting that stuff out that we've been capturing for the last 10, 20 years and start putting it on the internet. And these flips started to happen at Museums Victoria. It was in sort of 2001, 2002, where there were more people visiting museum websites than physically coming through the doors. And those numbers have only increased. People have been piling millions of items online since then. The Smithsonian now has 13.5 million digital records available. And they've got 2 million library volumes and 156,000 cubic feet of archival material. Museums Victoria's got over 100,000 items online. They've got over 1 million specimens online. The big aggregators like Europeana, this one's got 52 million online, and Trove has got 457 million items online. So I'm going to have a look at a couple of examples of these. And these aren't picking on individual institutions. I could give you hundreds of examples like this, but I'm only going to give you 2 today. But I could pull examples like this from institutions right across all of these sectors. This is a work from the NGV, a version of Rodin's Thinker. Contains a beautiful digital image like a lot of these collection sites. Contains some relatively basic metadata and some descriptive text. It doesn't contain a lot more than would have been included in a card catalogue or in a print catalogue. There aren't many links here that you can click on to navigate through other paths. There aren't relationships to other works or to source material. There are claims like this. Rodin initially intended to portray Dante, the 14th century Florentine author of the Divine Comedy. Again, we have no citation for that. We have no links. People interested in exploring that concept further don't have anywhere they can go from there. And if people work it out for themselves, every user that comes to that page then needs to go through exactly the same process over and over again. And given I'm using a Wikipedian protester as an example here, if we look at the Wikipedia page, we get this text that says, some critics believe the Thinker was originally intended to portray Dante at the gates of hell. There are questionable aspects to this interpretation, and there's some scholarly debate about it. Here's a reference, here's a book. I'm not saying Wikipedia is perfect, but its insistence on citing facts and its insistence on acknowledging contested ideas is a really important kind of aspect of things like humanities research that rarely gets reflected in collections and collections data. And I think we need to start thinking about how to start incorporating more of those connections to different ideas and different perspectives in more interesting ways. Here's another example which shows the problems of fielded data versus narrative data. So this is the metadata about a computer in the Science Museum in London. It's got an object number, it's got materials, it's got measurements. It says that it's a computer, which is fairly self-evident. It was lent by CERN, which is interesting and suggests there might be something going on here. And it does have a little label on it that says "do not power down," which is probably useful because it was the computer that Tim Berners-Lee designed the World Wide Web on. But if you look at the fielded metadata from that, you don't get any of that information in there. It's in the descriptive text. There's lots that's been written about Tim Berners-Lee and the development of the web, but you have to go and try and discover it all for yourself. The documents that Tim Berners-Lee wrote in the late 80s and early 90s about why the web was developed are all still available online, but there are no connections through to that, and everyone has to go through that process themselves every time. And Tim Berners-Lee himself has talked about kind of raw data now and say, we'll pile all your data online. And there is real value in that. And there's certainly value in putting data into shared spaces and being able to work with things like linked open data. But working in collecting institutions, we also can't expect just to pile all of our data like that fielded metadata from this item into those shared spaces and expect algorithms and machine learning and artificial intelligence to do all that work for us. There's so many connections in this space and so many interconnected things that we know about as researchers, as professionals working in these spaces all the time. Those relationships and interconnections are documented in other sorts of records and other sorts of systems. And yet we don't bring that stuff together in a way that makes it valuable, useful, and so we can expose it for the use of other people. There are a bunch of other barriers to doing this effectively, and some of them are the systems that we use. And it's not necessarily the systems themselves, it's the fact that so many parts of our professions use different systems and conceptualize them in quite sort of professionally bounded ways. And it's not just that different institutions use different systems, it's even sometimes that the same institutions use different systems for different parts of their work and different parts of their collections. So you can go into a lot of large museums and find that their library system is separate from the system that documents their artifacts, which is separate from the system that documents their archives. And that's in a single institution, let alone trying to connect things across institutions. So trying to do this work has technical barriers, and it also has process-based and people barriers in terms of the way that we choose to document things and conceptualize our collections. There's also a whole bunch of standards that we use right across the sector, and this is from a number of years ago, and the numbers have gone up since then. And we use different standards based on different professions or in different environments. And a lot of those standards are, again, fairly inward-looking and don't have a lot of relational capability in terms of being able to connect these things effectively out into other areas. Some of them do have good relational capability, and we need to think about which ones we're using and what we're using them for. And professionalization, no, this isn't a talk primarily about professionalization, that could be a whole separate talk, but it's really interesting to look at the history of the 20th century in particular and what happened with librarians, archivists, museum professionals, IT and computer professionals, all professionalizing, all forming associations, all trying to create their own sorts of identities. And it did it in a lot of cases by separation, delineation, by pulling things apart a bit and saying, no, there is a gap here, and we're different from that group over there. And that created some really interesting and continuing splits that we need to think about how to deal with in this sort of space. And I'm not saying that the answer to that is sort of full convergence and we're all the same and we all just need to come back together and forget about our professional identities. But we do need to be more conscious, I think, of the effects of processes like this and think about how to remediate some of those through some of the work that we do, particularly in a digital space. So from that 68 conference where people were talking about having accessible data banks for museum holdings and bibliographies and photo collections, that idea of a museum without walls that comes from the theorist Andre Malraux. And yet you go to many sites, again, this is just 3 examples, and there are many, many more examples of this, and you see these separations evident even in single institutional sites between research catalogues, libraries, archives, between photograph collections and other sorts of collections. And it's very difficult sometimes to navigate between the two. Aggregation has become a way that some people try and deal with this. Somewhere like the Smithsonian puts a search box over the top of all of its collections and says, well, this search box will allow you to look for museum objects, archives, library materials, more than 3 million online images, audio and video, et cetera, et cetera. But if you do that, then you might find something like this, an image of the of the jazz pianist Horace Silver. And this is a record that's in the museum collection that actually features the same image as part of its cover art. But you very quickly find that even in those aggregated searches, these things have come from two different data sources, and so they have quite different keywords, they have quite different terminology, they have quite different contexts. And once again, there's no explicit relationship or connection between these. Every single user has to find the connection for themselves. Hopefully the search term that you put in will bring up both of these items and you'll be able to see both of them, but if it doesn't, then you might miss that it contains both of these items in that single institution altogether. And if you start searching across multiple institutions, I love capybaras, and I was slightly disappointed there were only 27 documents in the whole of the Smithsonian out of 14.1 million that mention them. But you also get quickly into data that comes from multiple institutions, and there's no indication of how that data connects up, and there's no pathways and trails to follow. So things like this compared to something like that Australian Museum cascading display where you can touch something and see these other things group around it. You don't get those sort of opportunities in these sorts of digital collection interfaces. And search has been used as a way of interrogating collections for a long time, as we know. And it's always had its problems. I love this fact: in November 1997, only one of the top 4 commercial search engines could find itself in the top 10 results, which I think is amazing. And if there's any instance where an explicit relationship between, say, a search term and a result might have been really useful, this is probably it. But you've got to admire the kind of purity of saying, well, if we can't find ourselves, then we've just got to try and improve. But the people who wrote that article, Sergey Brin and Larry Page, went on to create Google and started thinking, well, how can we start to address this issue? But Google has become so dominant, and the idea of search has become so dominant, that I think we continue to just sort of throw stuff into spaces and say, let's put better search over the top, let's put more search resources over it. And there's only so much that search can do. So say we only have 100,000 items in our collection, and they've all got bits of metadata attached. This is what 100,000 dots looks like. And we might find one of those dots. But again, there aren't structures here that really give us many examples of where we can go next. What trails can we follow? What paths can we follow? What groups of material exist in here? What structures have been brought together as part of exhibitions or as part of research? You can't necessarily find that through a search interface when things are brought together in a shared space. I'm being slightly unfair, but if you look up aggregate in Google image search, you get images like this. And you get a whole bunch of material, and you might be able to find things in there. They are all kind of different. But there's a lot more that you could do in this space. And if you do find things, you kind of throw them back in the pile, and other people have to try and find things in there as well. And when we do start putting structures around things, again, there are exceptions to this, but quite often they're bound by many of the same thought processes and practices that have been around for a long time. They're bound by things like linearity and hierarchies. And in a lot of cases, even in a digital space, you find that things only exist in one place at the same time, as if we need to be still concerned about those constraints in the same way that we are in a physical world, something like a physical library book. So what if I told you there is no shelf? That's the second Matrix reference of the day. And I know that we kind of know that, but some of our practices still kind of reflect a way of thinking that's as if this stuff is still on shelves and we need to try and get to it. But we can put things in multiple contexts at the same time. Complex ideas, different perspectives, contested ideas can exist simultaneously in this sort of space, and we should be able to manage that in a digital environment more effectively than we do. What if I wanted to explore things as if they're a network, and every component that I get to, I can navigate down multiple pathways. But then when I get to another component, that becomes the kind of center of my attention, and there are multiple pathways from that I can follow as well. What if we wanted to think about collections not as kind of mathematical structures and hierarchies, but as non-hierarchical structures like a rhizome or a root? What if we wanted to follow pathways through collections that aren't the defined pathways provided to us by the infrastructure or by the large organizations? What if we wanted to follow our own path through things? And if multiple people followed the same path through things, what if we wanted to be able to see that path like we can see desire lines running through a park? So there's a sort of alternative history of computing here, which many of you will probably know. And there's some missed opportunities potentially along the way to rethink the way these sorts of things work. There was the automated cataloging component. There was the we need artificial brains component. But then there was this other kind of trail running through, trail probably being the operative word, that started with people like Vannevar Bush in 1945. Apart from this kind of Google Glasses-like camera that's mounted on a person's head, he also had an idea for this machine, which was never built, called the Memex, which does use microfilm as a technology, but isn't kind of bound as linear microfilm. You have a scanning device on one side, you have a keypad on the other side, you've got two panels, and you can start typing in codes and create connections or trails between things. You can connect up a couple of documents and then slide it across and connect it up to another document and follow pathways through collections of archives, publications, photographs, documents that you might have handwritten and scanned into the machine. And that remains in the machine's memory, so you can come back to that and follow those paths or those trails again. It's this idea that those trails don't fade. You can continue to navigate through them, or you can show them to other people, or you can share them. Around the same time, people like Alfred Kroeber were talking about the fact that although we have this kind of scientific hierarchical view of the tree of life, that human culture, which he sees as knowledge of good and evil, human culture is a different sort of system. It's more complex and entangled. It's got these elements that cross over each other, and it's constantly kind of changing and intersecting in interesting ways. He suggested that rather than using something like a tree, we should be thinking of other metaphors like a coral reef. And a reef provides a really interesting kind of metaphor for these sorts of things because it's got so much complexity in it. It's got sort of accumulations and accretions. It's got mineral deposits that have been there for many years that you can look back on like tree rings, but it's also got these changing aspects and these constant developments. A lot of those changes are made by communities, by people either visiting people, animals, creatures, visiting these environments, or living in parts of these environments. And that's creating this real diversity and complexity in a space. And it's a metaphor that was extended by people like Donna Haraway. And there's this amazing quote that I like from Donna Haraway, where she's talking about collections of interviews and comparing it to a coral reef. She says, "The layered conversations of patterned interviews among interlocutors who are distributed in time, space, linguistic commitments, and political yearnings mimic the complex communities of marine organisms whose traffic in sustaining nutrients and meaningful signals tie dispersed members into unquiet webs of polyspecific living tissue." What if we thought of our collections like that? There are other thinkers following this. Ted Nelson is another who is quoted a lot in this space, starting in the 60s, through to the 80s, through to the present. This sort of beautiful idea of things being intertwingled or intertwingularity. And that's about interconnection and the fact that everything is kind of enmeshed. And he's interested in this idea not just as technology, but as kind of literature, as he would describe it. And he was instrumental in the development of ideas around things like hypertext. And his idea with hypertext was that when you were reading, for example, a text in this sort of environment, that you could see the source material down the side, not just as citations, but you could actually navigate through those pathways to other source material, have a look at the source material, you could come back again. These were visible pathways and visible connections that you could follow in both directions. It's one of the interesting things and one of the limitations of something like the web is that they've got those things like hyperlinks or skip links, but when you hit one of those links and get to the other end, there's quite often not a link back the other way. These aren't two-way paths that you can follow through these sort of systems. And someone like Nelson was interested in kind of two-way paths that you could follow in multiple directions. So it's creating quite a different sort of environment from a navigation perspective. And Tim Berners-Lee, although Ted Nelson has been quite rude about him and said that he produced a really dumbed down version of the web, he was interested in some similar ideas when he was developing this in the late 1980s. Because at CERN, there was the problem of documents that were distributed throughout the institution. There's lots of people with knowledge in their heads. There were lots of projects where if you knew about a project, you couldn't find where all the resources were related to that. So he was interested in a knowledge management problem and the creation of an interconnected system that would help you navigate through materials to help convey knowledge to you without having to rely always on the knowledge of other people. There are a number of examples, again, that I could give of people and groups who are starting to work in other ways in this space. Again, I'm only going to give a couple. One of them is the research centre I've been connected to for 10 years or so now, the eScholarship Research Centre at the University of Melbourne. It's been working for quite a long time on kind of non-hierarchical networks of collection content and using explicit defined relationships, and those relationships containing things like types, descriptive information, date information, to start to create more complex networks of collections and related contextual information. There are institutions like the Tate who are starting to say, well, if we're going to put our collections online, then how can we do it in a way where there are lots of pathways that people can follow depending on what their interests are? So if you find an artist, for example, you get a biography, you can also see the Wikipedia entry. You can see artworks that they produced, you can see artworks where they were a subject, you can see film and audio recordings, feature articles, you can look at archival material, explore based on terminology. It's got a you might like section, so you might encounter works that you haven't seen before and that might be of interest. And if you start looking at things like archival material, unlike many institutions, you do see the archival item at item level, but you can also get into the archival hierarchy, which as an archivist I like to see on sites like this, which means that you could start by looking at Francis Bacon, but you could end up in a collection of something like the Hanover Gallery, because those things are really closely interconnected, and you could start to explore other artists through that archival collection. And this provides opportunities for people to navigate through these collections in really interesting ways. There's the Humanities Networked Infrastructure Project, which brings together a bunch of these collections, online collections like the Australian Dictionary of Biography and cinema databases and art databases and other sorts of material together into a system along with things like elements and newspaper articles from Trove. And it does have a search interface, but in addition to the search interface, you can also create your own connections between things. You can start linking content up. You can describe and define your own relationships in your own way, based on your own language and using your own sort of systems. And this is in a space where other people can potentially discover those interconnections and those relationships. So someone else might create a connection to the same thing, and then they'll discover the trails that you've made through these collections, and they can explore them themselves. And we need to think about community knowledge and representing that more effectively in collections as well. This image is actually the logo from an archives conference that's coming up in October in Adelaide called Designing the Archive. It's a big international archives conference. And the logo was developed by the artist Audrey Brumby, along with a graphic designer and a gallery director. And it's representing people connecting and linking, going around communities, talking, sharing, spreading stories and messages. And it's got this idea of kind of interconnected stories and knowledge again. And we see the same thing with the Ulenz group at Museums Victoria. Esther Kirby has talked about the fact that these stories are like patchwork quilts and you need to join all the patches together so you've got an overall story. And what if we started to think about knowledge and collections knowledge in that way? These notions are kind of weaving things together. Another sort of metaphor we could think about, and the word context itself has its origins in the Latin word meaning to weave or weave together. So what if we think about weaving things into their context or into different contexts and using that to rethink the way that we design our online collections and interfaces? There are notions of relationality in things like the queer community and in post-colonial studies, And this is just a small selection of many kind of works running across this space in the last 50 years or so, from anthropology to ethnography to feminist theory, material culture studies, sociology, physics, museology, archaeology. All these sorts of fields are looking at notions of entanglement and relationality and interconnection in really interesting ways. And we so rarely see those things reflected in digital collections and material culture material and publications and archives as they appear in online spaces. So this is thinking about knowledge in a slightly different way. And it's not necessarily thinking about it as fixed or universal. It's not necessarily thinking about it in terms of like reproducibility. These sorts of relational systems are changing all the time. There are flows and changes in this space. And those flows and those relationships are also changing the banks of the river. They're changing the things on each end of those relationships and intersecting with those things. They're different for every observer who comes to this space. Anthropologist Tim Ingold has said, we've been concentrating on the banks while losing sight of the river, yet were it not for the flow of the river, there would be no banks and no relation between them. What would it look like if we started to think about digital collections using concepts like this, and how would we present them differently to our users and our audiences as a result? So I'm going to leave you with a question rather than an answer. What would our online collections from libraries, from museums, from archives, from galleries, or our aggregators or our collective institutions, what would they look like if we started to do things differently and focused as much on the in-between, on the relationships and the connections and the trails and the pathways as we did on the discrete entities and collection items that we've been keeping on shelves and in storerooms for so long? If we started to rethink about the collection databases that we're publishing on online websites, what would they start to look like and what would our interfaces need to look like if we started to incorporate those sorts of ideas? Because as Donna Haraway said in 2006, this is not just a technology issue. She says it's relationalities all the way down, but they aren't always about machines, much less information technologies. We can't necessarily just sort of throw processing power or technology at this and expect to solve it. We need to reconceptualize the way we think about the materials that we work with. Because it's not just about technology, it's about our collections and about our organizations. It's about the communities we work with, and it's about all of us. Thank you.
So we do have some time for some questions. If you've got a question, I'd ask you to just wait for one of our runners with the microphone so that everybody can hear your question. Have we got any questions?
Everyone wants a drink?
Yes, over here.
Hi, I'm Helen from TAFE New South Wales. I just had for me, the biggest challenge I can see with all these connections is the maintenance of them. And you were showing all the catalogue records and why they didn't have links to other resources. And from a librarian's point of view, it's the maintenance of those links. Unless you can automate, so whenever someone removes the current location where that link is pointing, it's the maintenance that is the main thing that stops people linking. People love to link, but who's going to maintain those links unless you can automate it? Have you got any ideas about that area?
It is an interesting question, and there are certainly kind of technology issues and practice and process issues that need to be thought about in this space for these sorts of things to work effectively. I think some of that is about incorporating that information into the standards and things we use in ways where you can at least see a connection somewhere else. And if that somewhere else changes, then you can at least see there was a connection to that somewhere else rather than just a link that kind of stops and breaks. But we also need to think about the kind of long-term way that we work in this space. I mean, I used that example of a site in 1993 that is still online now, and that seems quite amazing at the moment. But we need to stop thinking of that as amazing and start thinking of what we do in online spaces as kind of environment where we can preserve and work with that sort of information in quite interesting ways. But I also think that no, in some cases, some of those connections will disappear and they will go. Some of them will be maintained in particular spaces by particular people or communities. And over time, those things will fade away again and be lost. But it doesn't mean that we don't need to provide some of those spaces as part of our collections to allow those communities to work with material in different sorts of ways. So, no, I think there are a bunch of different ways of looking at that, and some of it is about trying to maintain that over really long periods of time, and some of it is about providing working spaces where people can do interesting things over the next 5 years and 10 years, and those things gradually evolve and change over time as those relationships and connections change. Hopefully, if communities find this sort of stuff useful, user communities, they'll start thinking about ways to maintain those things, and so will organizations.
Sounds a bit like those inputs to the future that Genevieve was talking about, doesn't it? Do we have any more questions?
Have one from
Over this way, yes.
Hi, Mike. Thanks for that. That was great.
Thanks.
Academic publishing is really good at links. You know, citations are these very durable links that, and you know, academic publishing has worked out a way to make them persist, and now there are huge data structures built on top of them. So is it a matter of importing practices and so on from other fields, like you know, academic publishing in the kind of open science area, or is it more a matter of kind of socializing, you know, communities into different practices?
I think it's probably both. I mean, I don't think it's necessarily one or the other. That those interesting things about you know, citation in scholarly work is that the destination of that citation doesn't need to exist anymore, and the citation is still there, so it at least tells you that it was there at a particular point in time. And those sorts of things can be really effective. Interestingly, that's one of those classic examples of not having a two-way kind of system where you can go to an academic article and it be filled with citations, but you go to the other end of that and you can't see back the other way. So it is thinking about how to extract some of that information from those sorts of environments and provide visibility in both directions so that people can navigate through these sorts of systems more effectively. But some of it is about sort of socializing different ways of working and changing the way that we think about things. The presentation, the keynote from earlier today about kind of versioning of academic publications and breaking things up into segments and things like that. I mean, each of those little components in itself becomes something that you can relate things through in different ways and in different times. And if you start including time information in things like your relationship structures, then again, you can start to create more complex systems. So yeah, socializing and reconceptualizing that, but also using some of the existing practices in sort of new or extended ways.
Okay, we do have time for one more question. If there's somebody, yes, over here.
Hi, Mike. It's Ingrid here. This is not a Dorothy Dixer. I'm interested to know in your research whether you've actually looked at other domains to see how they work with automated annotation and the automated creation of links, and whether you've kind of seen opportunities to sort of see methods for reuse, and if you've got any reflections on that.
Did you have particular domains in mind thinking about that?
I was thinking about computational linguists who use automated annotation, the genomics research community that use automated annotation, but they're very, very different contexts.
Yeah.
The generation of documentation and links between entities.
Yes. I haven't looked at that a lot as part of my research, so it's not an area I know a lot about. There are certainly opportunities for doing computational or automated work and linking between things in this space, and I don't think that we need to discard that aspect of what we're doing and say, well, we need to start doing everything manually as kind of researcher-curated data sets or those sorts of things. But at the same time, particularly working with things like museum collections and handwritten archival material and books in libraries and other sorts of works, and you do find in those spaces that the work of actually creating the data that supports an more automated sort of system is as much work as creating connections and relationships manually between those things in the first place. Which is part of the reason why I think, well, if we think about our processes for documenting stuff in the first place and incorporate relationality into those sorts of processes, then some of that work, the stuff that we already know about, will be done already, and then we can use other systems to do other sorts of relationships and potentially infer or discover other connections.
Okay, so in my excitement to get us started, I neglected to acknowledge the important contribution our partners and sponsors make in supporting the conference, and in particular to Gale Cengage for their support as the conference platinum sponsor. So please join me in thanking Mike and our sponsors as well.